I've not prepped anything. So like, look, just take this whichever direction you think is going to be interesting. I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the podcast is pretty straightforward. We just started with 2 questions. Don't overthink them. And then we can just take whatever happens after.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right. Let's get going. Hello, welcome, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is the Study Success Blueprint. Hello, my name is Matthew Mace. This is the Study Success Blueprint. I have Michael Young with me here today, who's the co-founder of Linda's Health, the anti-CRO running radically faster and more reliable trials. Michael, thank you.
Hi, Matthew. Great to join you for this.
Now, we start every one of these podcasts off with the same question. So what in the medical industry is exciting you today?
Yeah, you sprung this on me about 30 seconds ago. And I feel like racing to try and narrow this down to just one thing. I mean, I think there are so many things that I could talk about, like from drug discovery, preventative healthcare. But I think I have to try and focus this on clinical trials, given what we're doing at Lindus. And I think that the number one thing is going to have to be changes to the way in which people are actually running trials due to technology. And like, look, that's a very broad answer. So sort of go into a bit more detail. I think it's a truism that the clinical trials and the CRO industry is 20 years behind the rest of the tech sector. And where technology has been used to date, I'm convinced that that's basically just been used to replicate the paper process, but electronically. And that's actually probably led to more inefficiencies in some ways. Only over the last couple of years that there has been an explosion in people applying technology in completely innovative ways to the way that trials are run. If you look at any YC cohort, any accelerator now, there's almost certainly going to be people looking at trial tech. We see companies that are doing things in digitizing trial protocols, automating data management, automating data monitoring, advanced methods of patient recruitment. And all of these things have the potential to actually change the way that people run trials rather than just move everything from paper into an electronic format. And obviously at Lindus, we're doing something similar, and our unique approach is that we're integrating the CRO service layer with that technology. It's amazing just that the amount of innovation that is happening across the board in this space right now.
I find it interesting. There's a lot of innovation going on. How well does it all work together? How well do these YC-backed companies collaborate? How do you collaborate well with the medical community? Are we at the golden age of we're all moving in the same direction, or is everyone moving apart?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets to the heart of like the fundamental problem these companies have, is that it doesn't matter how cool the tech you build is if there isn't a means for deploying and applying that to, and this isn't just true in trials, this is true in healthcare delivery as well, then you're not going to affect change. And in trials in particular, the problem that they've got is that they are trying to sell into CROs. So CROs are the service delivery partner, and CROs still fundamentally have no incentive to use them. Or they're trying to sell into like big pharma companies or biotech companies where they don't want to be piecing together 30 different solutions. That's probably similar in healthcare delivery as well. We talk to lots of companies that have got incredible diagnostics that GPs could use, or means of reading EHRs to identify rare disease. But the problem is any healthcare provider is going to struggle to deploy 2 or 3 of these, let alone the 30 or 40 things you'd need to do to span even just 50% of the diseases or cases that they're seeing on a daily basis.
Do you think there is one bottleneck to the deployment? And let's talk about the clinical setting rather than the trial setting. If I'm going to the GP, I'm pitching the 30th tool there is it the technology doesn't work, or it's a lengthy onboarding process, or there's not enough return on the time investment? Is there a theme there?
To some extent, these things need to be centrally driven. You just don't have the resource. I mean, let talk about this in a UK context for a second. Even the biggest GP groups don't have the resource to be deploying 10, 20 tools on an annual basis. They haven't got the contract teams to go through the commercial negotiations on each of these. And I think that these technology innovations need to be piloted, negotiated, and then sort of driven from the center. And that requires a new means of procurement from the center to be able to actually test these tools effectively, set out the criteria that they're going to be using to determine which things they're going to pilot and which
Mhm.
thing what success looks like.
So we'll come on to the centralized process, but maybe let's hone in on pilots. Pilots are incredibly difficult when you're a med tech company, let alone when you're a startup with a new innovative product which might have an approval in the US, but actually it's not being proven clinically effective. How do you think about that challenge of proving efficacy of deployment in a new trial format?
I sort of already kicking myself for sort of even suggesting that pilots would have to be a part of this process. And, and realistically, they probably do. But one of the classic traps that I think these early stage companies fall into is that they get into a handful of pilots and it's very unclear what is going to drive the next step. Those pilots take a couple of years to play out. That doesn't align with the VC funding model. And so you just have these companies dying sort of by pilot because they never get to the point
Mhm.
where they're able to commercialize. I'd say that's a very real problem. The best companies are going to find ways of being able to drive commercial traction outside of those procurement processes.
Mhm.
But that might mean that you're not going to be able to sell into the NHS within your first couple of years of existence. And I think that's probably going to stay the case. But that doesn't mean that there can't be use cases, whether that's looking at other geographies, whether that's looking at specific verticals that might not have been sort of your first choice, but there is sort of more of an incentive to buy. One of the reasons I think we've been able to be successful, and it's not a direct parallel, is that no one was going to trust us to run a massive clinical trial, with our own technology stack from scratch. But by identifying early adopter segments, whether that's like digital health, consumer health, and being able to start like learning from those ourselves, but also to generate case studies and proof points to go to bigger customers, we were able to get up that complexity curve pretty quickly. If you're doing and your business plan rests upon running a couple of pilots and hoping they go well, then I think any company is going to struggle.
You drew the parallel there between pilots and what you do in and trying to find early adopters and innovators. Were there any major wins along the journey for you where you learned something out of a not a very large contract, if I can put it that way?
Completely, like we learned an enormous amount from our early trials, and they were big wins in terms of winning them and then being able to successfully deliver them. Our first trial, two trials were with companies called Myota and Habitual Health in the metabolic space. It just so happened that they had really forward-leaning founders. We were able to do those, I think, on competitive terms and show how we were going to be able to do this in a way that a big CRO couldn't. And they, I guess, like, took a gamble on us and it paid off for them. And it, certainly helped us because we were then able to say, look, we have run these trials. You can talk to our customers. You can look at our database and use that to win sort of bigger and more complex trials over time.
Good insights. For the listeners who don't know you, how did you get into here? How did you end up being a founder of a clinical trials company? I don't think you trained in clinical trials in school, right?
No, that's right. Yeah, my sort of so my career was originally in consulting, doing predominantly healthcare and life sciences, with a sort of brief interlude in a technology company. I then went into government and was working as a special advisor to the UK Prime Minister, and it was there during COVID and ended up getting pulled into a lot of life sciences work, sort of more by accident than design. And it was sort of fascinating as well, trying to answer the question, like, what can the UK do to improve its share of global R&D and to capitalize on the advantages we have in the UK? Of course, like one of them is health data, amazing academic institutions. But I sort of had this light bulb moment during the COVID vaccine trials. So we were helping to clear the regulatory hurdles that they had. And one of my friends from university, Mary, who is now my co-founder, was taking part in one of the vaccine trials, and just the experience on the ground was terrible. Like basic technology just didn't work. Having to go into hospital to fill in paper forms at the height of the pandemic. and suddenly realized that in government, we really focused on like foundational research and market access and very little on the clinical trial infrastructure piece. And came to the conclusion that so many of the problems that we're seeing were actually downstream of this.
Mhm.
In that it incentivizes companies to bet on individual indications or target specific therapeutic areas, all because of the problems of running clinical trials. And we just became convinced that if you can fix clinical trials, you can have a massive outsized impact on human health. It's not just about increasing the time to market by 10, 20%. And then additionally, we had this insight on how to do that. And we think the heart of the problem is the CRO industry.
Mhm.
And the fact that because they are billing out labor by the hour, they're not incentivized to run a trial faster or to use new technology or new trial methodologies. And so we decided we were going to try and disrupt the CRO space with vertically integrated CRO and trial technology. And that's what we're doing. Unfortunately, like we've been able to grow very quickly, capitalizing, I guess, on the poor experience that companies have working with CROs.
Mhm. Mhm. And I'll come back to the CRO point in a second, but I think every country wants to believe that they're world beating in terms of their research, but
Yeah.
the reality on the ground is that things are run on paper and things get lost, and we're not able to prove the efficacy because a trial, for example, failed its primary endpoint because they included patients who were not eligible for the trial,
Yeah.
and that's just a poor basic misjudgment of the researcher conducting that trial. Do you think governments or even CROs are very myopic in terms of how they go, we're applying this technology and therefore everything is good, and forgetting what's happening downstream at the sort of coal face of a trial?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think that if a CRO is only building technology around how you analyze the data, then yeah, they're being myopic and they're definitely not solving the problems. A technology solution has to go all the way back up to how are you collecting data. Yeah, I think your fundamental analysis there is definitely right that where we're talking about groundbreaking research, often we're talking about innovative trial designs and scientific breakthroughs rather than actually how are things being conducted. And if you can make it easier to conduct research, to collect data, to check patient eligibility, then you make the whole system exponentially more efficient. And that means that the scientists who are doing groundbreaking things can focus on what they're good at, not cleaning up data sets or having to fix this problem where that the primary endpoint fails because of patient eligibility. So yeah, in clinical trials, it's 100% true that the data has to be electronic from start to finish, and it's not enough to focus on one part of it and say we're going to innovate here.
What particular innovation in your tech stack do you think has really pushed you and the team forward?
I'm going to answer with sort of a continuation of my previous point, which is that the biggest innovation that underpins everything is that there is a single unified database with all trial data. Now, like that, like it sounds obvious, sounds simple, but on so many trials, like that isn't the case. You hear of all of these clinical trials where just to run interim analyses, they are freezing data sets, exporting them, manually patching together the different data sets from different sources, and then running that analysis. But having that single unified database means that we can start doing clever things on top of it.
Mhm.
And so where we're looking at automating data management or data monitoring, yeah, by which I mean sort of doing 95% the manual work, with AI, so that CRAs and data managers can focus on high value add. That isn't possible unless you have that single unified database. So the fundamental innovation is that you need to be collecting electronically at source, and then everything else builds on top of that. So if there's a second thing, it's the integration with the service layer. I began this by saying that clinical trial providers are basically replicating what's on paper. That's not actually to blame them. That is what customers want. They want to bill out CRAs and data managers because that is how they make their money. So even if Medidata or Viva was to roll out this automated data management or data monitoring piece, would CROs buy it? I'm not convinced they would unless they
Mhm.
could find a way to build for it, and that would require changing their business model.
I mean, business models are tricky, and we spoke about in my last podcast with Kunjan Butt. They're in the business of running clinical trials as a site, and
Yeah.
they have a perverse incentive sometimes to overbill because there's inefficiencies that they're having to deal with because they're working with a certain CRO or a certain tech stack, or there's a certain patient that's a little bit more difficult. How do you challenge the status quo there? How do you challenge the trial design? But then, if I think of it more practically, any advice to help a researcher or a trialist design a trial up front?
I mean, yeah. How can CROs or trialists make it easier for sites? I mean, the first thing is that challenge what are you trying to test. The majority of trial complexity and problems come from 20% of the trial decisions will cause 80% of the problems. And whenever trialists are getting together, there is a tendency to say, how do we make this as academically rigorous as possible? Let's put in more exclusion criteria. Let's add some secondary endpoints with things we might find interesting. And every time you do that, you don't just make it linearly more complex, it becomes exponentially more complex. And if what you're interested in is the primary endpoint, I would just challenge trialists to say, you should have to justify any extension beyond that. That means that trials will run on time. They'll be more cost effective. They'll be easier for sites to run, less prone to protocol deviations, lower data variability. But it also means that you can run more trials. And I would push that it is better to run more lean, pragmatic trials than to run these sort of behemoths that are difficult to run and probably like might not be successful because of the complexity that has been built into them. And I think everyone benefits from that, from the trialists to the sites to ultimately the patients.
And in a business context, we talk about the blue oceans, right? And we're trying to find those trials that never would have been run before. Just to read that back, that's what you're hitting on. If we have a lean trial that completes in a year rather than 2 years, we're able to run smarter, more meaningful, more impactful trials, but also get innovation to patients faster.
Every trial is going to have a purpose. Like some trials are run for foundational, but like blue ocean research. Some of them are marketing questions. Others are phase 4 indication extension. Not necessarily novel, but like figure out what your trial is trying to do. What is the primary endpoint to do that, and try and stick as closely to that as possible.
And so if I extend that one more, where then complexity time is added is those additional questions, because one data point isn't one data point, it's multiplied by how many visits the patient comes in.
Look, I've been on so many of these calls where the primary endpoint is some blood marker, requires the patient to go in for a blood draw. And then they think, oh, but actually they're already on site, so we might as well add a CT scan, like, or whatever. That doesn't sound that complicated, but that's suddenly another department within the site that needs to be involved. That patient needs to move between departments within the site. And actually, you've not got one secondary endpoint more complex. You've doubled the amount of time on site. That's a patient burden. There's administrative cost associated with that. And every time you do that, every time you add something, there is an exponential complexity rather than just that linear, one additional endpoint. And I don't think that trialists think about it in that way. So I definitely encourage them to think it through from the site perspective and think, you've got this patient in your practice. What flow are they actually going to have to go through in order to collect this data?
And do you sit with the trialist? You sit with the sponsor of the trial to walk them through that? I go, Michael, here's my trial. I want to test whether this works in diabetic patients. I want to check their weight loss, but it would be also really nice to monitor their quality of life and also their blood alcohol level or what, any other
Yeah.
random thing.
So generally, a sub-sponsor will come to us with a protocol synopsis. And from the first time we speak to them, we will start stress testing the assumptions that they've made and say, look, by adding this exclusion criteria or the endpoint, we think you're increasing your timeline, your cost, or your risk. And sponsors vary in how receptive they are to it. But the sponsors we end up working with tend to be the one that value the expertise that we can bring from an operationalizing of the trial. And we'll keep doing that. Like during the actual protocol writing, we will bring in KOLs, we'll bring in patients, and their input is essential for actually getting to an optimal trial design. The worst case is where a sponsor comes with a sort of fully formed protocol and says, "Oh, we want you to run this." And if someone's doing that, like frankly, we're probably not the right partner for them. I mean, actually, I remember one example where the protocol specified that the electronic data was going to be stored at a local server at the site level. And we're like, pointing out that that makes no sense, but they'd already signed off the protocol. They didn't want to change it. And so, we walked away. But
Mhm.
but small things like that in a protocol, if you don't have the operational input, can end up causing much bigger problems down the line.
And you've sort of hit that point a couple of times, which is the actual delivery, the actual operation, the actual patient involvement is at the forefront of what you're talking about at Lindus, right? But
Yeah.
that isn't the case across the broad industry, where we're failing to not build protocols that are fully operationalized or able to be implemented, with ease. Because if I look at the data over the last decade, the duration of trials has increased despite increasing the number of sites participating in those trials. Like, that math doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know what the root cause of it. Certainly, I know that like the proximate cause for us is that there are scientists who are not trialists working on the protocol who say, what is going to be the most scientifically valid or most scientifically interesting protocol without linking that to the operationalization. You've then got biotechs who don't want to push back on their scientific advisors or don't know how, or things that have been signed off and funded on that basis that are then coming in to ask for operational input too late. Why has there been a change in that over the last 10, 20 years? I'm not sure. I think part of it probably is that the CRO industry has become significantly worse in that time period. And so people just don't trust them as a partner to go to and actually ask for these like serious design questions.
You and I met when I was an idiot and tried to run a 1,600 patient trial on my own, which, almost killed me. But it helped me appreciate that everything I was asking for, someone had to deliver. Do you think that sort of sense of what it's like on the ground when a trialist or a scientist or, the VP of a very big CRO, this is not, degrading them in any sense. It's not being at the front of how it's being delivered is lost in the translation of myriads of documents.
Yeah, it's definitely it's lost in the documents. People have a tendency to push blame elsewhere, whether that's to the CRO or to the site. But if a site is having multiple protocol deviations, like the problem might not be with the site, it might be with the protocol and its complexity. So yeah, definitely a level of empathy for the other like stakeholders within the trial is essential.
Let's think 5 years in the future. We fix the issues in clinical trials. If I come back to a point you raised earlier, having a sort of a unified database, unified platform, making those data exchanges a little bit more efficient, do you think that unlocks the future where we can employ automation and other techniques to really drive innovation forward and make newer discoveries?
In general, having the data accessible in any situation is going to enable you to make better decisions that aren't not just better decisions than you could make on a fragment of that data, but actually to make a decision. In a clinical trial context, that might be the data monitoring, the data management piece. In a healthcare context, that might be the electronic health record. And by having more of it, you're able to make a diagnostic without having to go and conduct more tests, or it actually creates new opportunities rather than just allowing you to do what you were doing before, but slightly better. So
Yeah.
not advocating for the creation of data lakes, but generally data interoperability, the ability for clinicians to talk to other clinicians about an individual patient's data or about a patient is going to have massive benefits for sure.
What's the roadmap like for the next, 3 to 5 years for Lindus, but what's the roadmap or the optimal roadmap for the entire industry?
Obviously, I think that they're pretty similar. We're building the future of the clinical trial industry. Sort of the key thing that I've been in using a descriptor for what we're working towards is is real-time adaptive clinical trials. And that is partly just my hypothesis that the fundamental change that we could make to how people then even conceive of trials and feeding back into pipeline is if you can run agile trials that the sample size adapts. You run multiple arms in different indications. You can then shut those off after 3 months rather than waiting 2 years for your readout. Like that has enormous advantages for indication selection, target selection, biotech funding. But even if my hypothesis there is wrong, that is the transformative change that we can work towards, all of the things that underpin that are things that have immediate good. In order to do that, you need to be able to monitor the data in as close to real time as possible. You need to be able to check that the data is being collected accurately, missing data is being flagged. And those are things that AI technology are supremely well placed to be able to do. So the advent of real-time adaptive trials is probably within sort of the next 3-4 years, and that if we can achieve that, you'll be able to run 5 times as many clinical trials within the same budget envelope, and that has a transformative effect on the life sciences industry. To answer the second part of your question, sort of more seriously than I did, what's happening across the rest of the industry? I think there are very really interesting innovations in things like digital twins in trial simulation. As the understanding of biology is improving all the time, so getting to a point where you actually might be able to predict trial outcomes by understanding proteins, the genome more effectively. Those aren't the areas that we're focused on, but all of those things will improve the candidates that are coming through the drug pipeline. They're still going to need clinical trials, and obviously our objective is to be that layer that just allows people to run their trials as quickly and effectively as possible.
Appreciate it. I'll leave it at this. Is there an end game to clinical trial development? It's a loaded question, and it probably has an obvious answer. But
no, I don't think there is. I think the goalposts should move as we innovate, as we improve the way trials are run, as the way that trials changes to reflect advances in human health. Trials should change. The fact that they haven't changed in the last 20, possibly 30 years in any fundamental sense is a reflection on the failure of the life sciences industry.
I appreciate it, Michael. Thank you for that. We can't leave on a negative note. Have you got anything positive to share for us?
I go back to my first point. I think that innovation is happening in a way that it never has done. It has never been easier to develop technology that can have a transformative impact. Companies need to solve how they get the traction and apply that to clinical trials. But look through the list of any of these accelerators and see the companies that are out there, and you can't help but be filled with hope for the opportunity that there is and the fact that people are now taking this challenge seriously.
Cool. Well, thanks, Mike, for joining me. This has been great. We'll do this again. We'll continue the talk, and we'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Matthew.
I would like to thank Michael Young for joining me today. Michael is the co-founder of Lindus Health. Lindus Health is the anti-CRO running radically faster and more reliable trials. I have no financial interest in the company, but please reach out to him and the team. What they do is use technology in new ways to transform how clinical trials are run. And I really dig what they do. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, subscribe at where you like to listen to podcasts. Join me next time where I'm speaking to Amy Bland from Curo Research as we discuss how to get more community sites inside clinical trials. So with that, I can leave you today. Speak to you very soon. I've been Matthew Mace, and this is the Study Success Blueprint. We spoke about measles last time. It was quite funny because I was in Texas. There's measles outbreak in Texas, believe it or not.
Is it linked to anti-vax?
Yeah, it's. I was teaching my daughter when we went to the science museum. I was like, vaccines are very good, and she was telling everyone vaccines are good. It's like, great. I've started with one.